Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox, and in a previous video I talked to you about the strategy triangle and how that applies to War of the Visions, but I want to talk a little bit deeper about what's required for each strategy and make this a bit more concrete, while also including a bunch of niche strategies. This is going to cover 3 main strategies that I talked about before and 6 niche strategies. And these 2 classes are not mutually exclusive. So if you're running, say, a damage down team, then you're probably going to be running that as a sustain team or potentially as an economy team, but a lot of these niches are going to have particular overlaps or synergies with the main strategies. So you kind of want to pick one of each, and this isn't going to cover every type of team. Some teams just do well with their general strategy and let that guide them, but some also want to play some sort of a niche as well. And especially if you're hunting for a particular team, niche teams can serve you quite well if you know what you're going up against. So first off, we have Rush, and this type of strategy is epitomized by applying pressure to the opponent. You want damage, agility, haste and agility up can support that. CT up can definitely support that. You also want CT down for your opponents. Slow and agility down for your opponents also work to kind of drive that wedge. Movement up so that you can get to them faster. Actually, range also works pretty well for that. And then the following statuses. Curse, because it prevents them from healing or sustaining, so this can kind of shut down sustain. HP drain removal could also work, but I think Curse is more important. And then there's also Berserk and Sleep. Berserk and Sleep both disrupt your opponent, and Berserk's really good against magic damage dealers because it can really throw them off their game in terms of damage, but both of these statuses allow you to do additional damage while the status is in effect, which is pretty awesome. And then if you're trying to wombo combo somebody, it can help to shut them down completely, and stop, disable, or paralyze can do that for you. So you're really trying to end the game as quickly as possible, using that to keep your team safe, and all of these statuses can help support that. For sustain, you're focusing on your defenses. Now, as I noted in my previous video, you still only want maybe like a tank or a healer and 2 other damage dealers, but in comparison to most strategies, this is still focused more on defense. For your damage dealers, you're going to want HP drain. You're going to want ways to push relevant resistances up. You're also, something that's been helpful is man resistance or man eater down. Both of those can generally decrease damage. It's also becoming more and more possible to reduce people's penetrations, and this is kind of birthing its own strategy right now that I think has been proved out by a couple of teams to a certain degree. Debuff resistance can also help keep you all of your beneficial statuses high. Re-raise Encourage to help keep your units on the map. Barrier, re-raise, courage, and debuff ceiling to help keep all those things safe. Curse resistance, 50% works for most things, and 75% or at least 67% can stop Sephiroth as well. And then finally, healing power up helps you with your healing strategies, or self-healing strategies, and all sustain teams, whether they're running a healer or not, want to have healing strategies. For economy teams, we're talking about tempo, and this can affect the game in a number of different ways, but one of the ones, so rush teams affect the agility and CT tempo, sustain teams affect the HP and damage tempo, economy teams are going to more focus on AP as a way of attacking the metagame, but they're also going to be able to use other economic-based strategies from rush and sustain, so they can combine some of the other elements as well. So this is going to be like AP restored nullification, which we can get through the blade stream. AP down, there's a lot of different ways to apply AP down. You can even apply AP down to all of your hits. For yourself, for your team, you're going to want either AP restore or AP cost down to make sure that your AP is abundant while your opponent's AP is laughable. You really want to drive that wedge as far as you can, and having all 4 of these things together is pretty important. Frostbite also can benefit this and do a lot of the same things for you. Haste and slow, applying haste to yourself and slow to your opponents, will really maximize the rate at which you gain CT and they don't. So you're driving a wedge in that way with those two statuses. They also counter each other, so if they're using haste, you can counter that with slow. Same is true for regen and poison, so having regen on your team can help you sustain longer. Having poison on their team will hurt their ability to sustain, and your poison can cancel their regen, which kind of doubles the effect. Then we have HP drain. This is important for economy teams because it's one of the most powerful effects in the game, so it should definitely be used here. CT up and down to help maximize and kind of combine with the haste slow strategy to really drive a wedge between, if you're taking more turns than your opponent consistently, you're probably going to win. And then healing power down, also HP drain removal, and curse, all for dealing with heavy sustain teams. Now, with those main strategies out of the way, you might be wondering, how do I narrow that down? Right? How do I choose my team and equipment? Well, you narrow it down by looking at a niche that you want to play. One of the ones that I want to talk about first is damage down. Now, technically there's a lot of teams throughout the game that have really tried to raise their effective HP, and a lot of the more common and older forms of defenses are now laughably easy to penetrate or bypass, such as defense and spirit or attack type resistances. Very commonly, slash attack units, because there is high slash resist in the game, will run up to 100% slash resistance penetration. So one of the things that you want to be able to do here is remove people's penetrations, and there are ways of doing this in the game. One way of doing this, interestingly enough, and adding it to all of your hits and allowing it to compound, is through Nikel's TMR, which is a piece of clothing that can be equipped by many people. So this can bring one of the key parts of this strategy to basically any team, which makes it fairly flexible. Also, it can be helpful to have barriers and the ability to seal barrier destruction. Supportive buffs are really important here, like they are for sustain teams, and you're also going to want to get your resist up even further, but also to have high resist to begin with. And having the high resist to begin with is really what's going to guide unit selection for this team the most, because not all units have the ability to get their resistance up, or even with buffs, to the point where a strategy like this could be effective. You also want man-eater resistance, man-eater down. Both of those things will just generally make you more durable. Because you are pushing defense and spirit, you want defense and spirit up. Usually this can come with buffs that provide defense and spirit penetration removal for your opponents, so those can go hand in hand. Debuff resistance to keep your buffs up, and buff sealing so that they can't get their buffs up, because there are a lot of characters who will come into a battle with 40 to 60% penetrations and then expect to get the other 40% from their attacks. If you can prevent them from doing that, then there are a lot of teams that you can really hold back their ability to deal you damage. And we've seen a lot of modern knight-esque characters, Duran, Lilith being good examples, being able to do this as well. Evasion. This is an age-old mechanic for this game. It comes and it goes, but the basics of it are always about the same, with a couple things that have been added over the years. Agility, luck, and evasion. Those are the three things that you are maximizing in every way for this, because those are the three stats that play into your evasive potential. So you want to be maximizing all of those. Also, something that's super helpful that a lot more evasion units are getting these days than before and can really help them out in a variety of situations is sure hit avoidance. There's also specific types of evasion that are specific to certain weapon types, like maybe you could have an additional 25% chance to avoid slash attacks. That can be helpful in niche situations. Being able to raise your agility, not just getting haste, but actually raising your agility through a vitalize effect, is also helpful for your evasion. There are a lot of attacks that apply certain buffs until you take a certain number of hits. Evasion units are set up best to exploit these type of effects. And then also, for similar reasons, accuracy down and blind against your opponents can really solidify your advantage and shut your opponents out of being able to hit you if they ever had a chance. And finally, for when you do take a couple hits and then stabilize, or take a hit before you can get a buff in to boost your evasion, or before you can get in blind or accuracy down, you want to be able to heal back, so self-healing can be important for this group as well. Then another group that's really coming into its own recently, this one has come and gone, but I think, especially in Grand Arena right now, it's doing really well, but ranged teams. So for ranged teams, you want range up. Obviously, it's kind of what it's named after. Haste and agility up, either one, because they're going to increase your CT both. You know, this isn't like evasion where the CT up is less useful. Haste is less useful because you want your raw agility to go up so you evade better. Either one of those is pretty useful here. As an aside, of course, any place where you want to use haste, you also want to be using slow on your opponent so that you maximize your speed advantage over them. Also, follow-up hits. Right now, I don't think there are really any gunners or missile units that have native follow-up hits for themselves, with the exception of Shurika, who is a black mage. She's not a traditional ranged unit, but she does have very good range. She's basically the only one. However, there are at least 2 gunners at this point, and I believe 2 other units that can follow up other people's hits. And if you pair them with a ranged unit kind of in the back, then they can do additional damage off of ranged characters, and you want to get as many hits in before they get to you as possible, so follow-up hits are really important for making this happen. In fact, I would say follow-up hits are pretty important for rush as well. I'm just running out of slots. Ranged units are also really going to like CT up and down mechanics, because ranged teams are effectively a rush team. They're just a very specific type of it. So you're going to see a lot of overlap, and most of the strategies that work on rush are definitely helpful here. This is, though, the only team that likes to apply movement down to itself so that it stays out of range of its opponents, and you're kind of triggering the AI to not move forward as much, which is going to keep them out of range better, which is helpful. But they also want to be applying movement down to the opponent, because if you have movement down on both sides of the field, that just maximizes the number of turns before they get in range to deal damage to you. Healing power down, curse, HP drain removal is less important because you're hoping that they don't get a chance to hit you. But healing power down and curse can be really important for stopping people from stabilizing with healers as you're trying to chug them down. Also, courage and re-raise removal are important for this strategy too. It just removes like one more turn, one more hit that you would have to do to take them out, because you want to be taking out people as quickly as possible. Again, both evade and range strategies have a high overlap with rush, but I would say like range is a very specific form of rush, where evasion is, it can play a couple different things depending on how it goes. It is mainly a rush strategy, but it can have characteristics of others, where, ranged is just rush with guns. And then casters. So this is just for, when I say casters, I mean specifically units that have a casting time, or casting time mechanics. There are a lot of magic units that would fit onto this team that don't have that, and they're kind of preferable. You can ignore the second part for characters like that, but in general, all of these mages are going to have a very high starting AP, which means that they don't have as many concerns with AP as other teams will have. They're also pretty much immune and pretty resilient to AP denial economy strategies, which can kind of make this a good base for an economy team. Casters often have access to healing a little bit more often than other people do as well, so this could also work into a sustain strategy as well. But just because you have your full AP at the beginning of a fight also means that you can rush into combat without your buffs a little bit more effectively than physical units can, so you could kind of rush with this team as well. And I mean, really, I'm just talking about magic units, which is at least like a third to a half of the game, so like, I have to be very general because I'm talking about most characters here. This is the biggest niche. It's a very big niche. It's also important for them to get silence and berserk resistance because these two, there are a lot of statuses that you want to worry about with casters because they're going to have a very high faith. So you're going to want to run general status resistances. You're going to want to run especially resistances to any meta statuses at the time if you're running an all caster team. But Silence and Berserk are the most debilitating for casting units, so you definitely want to avoid those. Next we have what I call the Marlboro team. These teams are just curveballs, pure and simple curveballs. They probably play best as economy teams, but it depends on what units you're using and what their capabilities are. But I would say generally like economy and specifically like the AP denial portion of economy, and also maybe the caster subtype works. Both of these align very well with Marlboro teams. And one of the reasons is that Marlboro teams, whether they're magic or not, want to have a higher faith than most other teams. So there's a natural overlap with dealing magic damage here that's, you know, quite considerable, even though Marlboro teams don't necessarily have to be all mage in the way that a caster team would. And what you're trying to do here is basically shut down the game through status effects, because characters can only defend against so many of these at a time, teams can only defend against so many of these at a time. You should definitely be using units and statuses that are meta, but also throwing in some things that people aren't necessarily expecting right now. Having a wide variety of status effects at your disposal can increase the chances that you'll line up with someone's lack of resistance to them. It's also pretty important to have characters that have increased chances of landing certain statuses. An example of this that would be really good against casters is Ashen Mont, who gets an increased chance to silence all the way up to 50% while he has AP Restore active. Or there's also Agrius, who has a 50% chance to stop while Regen is active for her. But there are characters that natively have up to a 67% chance to proc their abilities. Typically Stun has a really high chance, which kind of helps it because it only lasts usually for one turn, so it can be kind of weak if it weren't for the fact that you know more than most other statuses that it's very likely to land, especially against mages. But also Sephiroth's Curse is of particular note as a 67% chance to proc ability, and some abilities even go further than this. There are situations where Helena the Black Rose can have like an 80+ percent chance to sleep, which is amazing, because that's only going to get multiplied by faith and all sorts of other things. Also, a thing that can be pretty helpful for these teams, there's a number of TMRs that can just add a chance to inflict a specific status to each one of your hits. So this can be a way of turning all of your attacks, whether they're status attacks or not, into status attacks. And this can even allow you to layer additional statuses onto abilities. Let's say you apply Frostbite chance to all of your attacks, and then you attack with something that can paralyze as well. Well, you have a chance of now inflicting paralyze and or Frostbite. And both of those things, if they happen together, you start getting paralyzed and losing your AP, you're going to be pretty much useless when you're out of that cycle. That would be an interesting combination to run together, and it is technically possible. You could also double down. I did a whole video showcasing the fact that Mont can equip the chance to silence on hit TMR, boost his own chance of silencing, and then when he uses his silence skills, he gets effectively 2 chances of 50% chance to proc silence, which is pretty much guaranteed against most mages, and is pretty incredible. And then, probably one of the simplest and most effective, at least, I don't know, you're almost always going to find mono elemental teams to counter in a lot of situations. Even though they're a lot less popular and a lot less dominating than they used to be, this is still a strategy that's a perennial favorite and probably one of the easiest to build. And as such, it's the most general. There are espers. Naturally, espers resist their opposite element when you were talking about UR espers, but there are also specific espers that have heightened resistances through their boards. For instance, tetrasulfid can get up to 25% wind resistance, and dark tetrasulfid can get up to 25% earth resistance. So this can be a pretty strong backbone to building a character with 100% of a certain elemental resistance. So having a couple espers like this for your team can be really important. Also, a lot of elements have elemental resistance VCs. If you can stack 2 of these, it can be possible to get somewhere like 33% or so added resistance to an element. So if you combine this with some of the espers we were talking about earlier, then in addition to your base resistances, that's 58% resistance. In addition to that, if you also want to run the elemental specific porcelain tower ring, that should offer you, I think, another 25% resistance. So now we're all the way up to 83% resistance. And if your character already has some resistance to that and maybe has some additional resistances through a support ability, you could easily hit 100% with that combination, and that's really what you're trying to do here. It can also help to have eaters for the element that you're going up against, which will increase your damage against them. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So, with all that being said, those are the most notable strategies in War of the Visions. If you have other niche ideas, there are some things I didn't cover, specifically like the counters to these niches, because whenever one of these niche type teams becomes popular, there are counters. There's definitely anti-magic teams that can deal with casters particularly well. There's definitely accuracy teams that can deal with evade pretty well. But what is required to overcome those teams is kind of the inverse of what those teams want to do. You basically make them unable to do the thing that they want to do, or do the opposite of it. So those teams are kind of self-explanatory. I felt like this is kind of the minimum that I needed to explain to cover most of the things that you'll see in War of the Visions. But if you have other ideas or other types of teams that you've noticed that you'd like to mention, let me know in the comments. And if I see some really cool ideas, or you bring something to my attention that I hadn't thought about before, then I'll include those in a future video. But with all that being said, check the description for links that will show you other Jackie Fox content, all sorts of stuff if you like this. Also remember to like and subscribe, and know that sometimes making content on YouTube can be controversial, especially for video games like this. Sometimes I can run afoul of content policies. And for that reason, it can be really helpful for you to also ring the bell while you're liking and subscribing. And in addition to all of that, I am a writer. I write books. They are available on Amazon. Just look for Jackie Fox, and brightly colored covers of fantasy and fiction. In particular, It Even Happens While We Sleep, one of my most recent books, set as a sort of near past cyberpunk muck through the COVID era America. That is available in hardback for only $15 right now. So it's a great deal to pick up for yourself or a loved one for Christmas, or, you know, whatever reason you feel like buying books. Or you could just donate to the channel to help support and help giving me motivation to continue making these videos. I mean, I know it's kind of a small niche audience for this type of content anyways, and that can make other forms of funding a channel particularly difficult. So, you know, with that in mind, helping make this worth it for me is a great thing for you to do. I'd really appreciate it. You can find me on Patreon or Ko-fi as Jackie Fox. And with all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.